It's time to talk about some super flexible quotations for inspector calls that you can use for any question. We're just going to go through and analyse them. So these are the stage directions from the opening of the play. You could talk about them as stage directions. Obviously that means it's Precy's choice, and then you can talk about the juxtaposition between the two. So the idea is that the lighting is pink and intimate before the arrival of the inspector. That suggests a kind of comfortable, cosy setting, quite close. That's what intimacy means, and that they're familiar with each other. However, you could argue that there's an irony to this, as you know, this is a facade that the family put on, and the inspector shatters it once he arrives. Now, the idea of it being pink lighting, lots of people would comment on this as a metaphor for this idea of rose-tinted glasses. It's up to you whether you kind of buy into that idea, but it definitely tells us that they feel perhaps protected and safe, and that it's a very private space for the family. Now, the change then when the inspector arrives, this idea of brighter and harder, these are what we call comparative adjectives, and they indicate a shift in the mood and the atmosphere once the inspector arrives. Now, you can really talk about the inspector as kind of shining a light on the family and their immoral actions and the things where they've gone wrong, and it breaks that intimate setting that is kind of created in the opening of the play. Now, also people will argue that this lighting reflects the idea of like a police interrogation, kind of spotlight on the family. Another great quotation that you can use again for any character, including the inspector, Eva Smith, or any of the family, is the descriptions, opening stage directions when the inspector arrives. So again, you can talk about them stage directions, therefore a choice that Precy makes, and you can look at the sharp ring of the doorbell. It's also used later on in the play when the real inspector calls at the end, the telephone call rings sharply. So you can talk about repetition, but the adjective sharp suggests like a sudden cutting off of Mr. Burling. Obviously, as you know, the inspector arrives when Mr. Burling is making his kind of capitalist speech about community and all that nonsense, and he's cut off with the sharp ring of the doorbell. Now, the inspector's arrival is described as he's a character with massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. This is a tricolon of 3 nouns used to emphasise his power. And if we look at each one individually, we've got this idea of massiveness. His presence fills the stage, and it should overwhelm, Mr. Burling and the other characters on stage who feel like they're in a position of power. This solidity, he can't be erased, can't be forgotten. His entrance is a permanent, solid impact on the family. And then the idea of purposefulness. His intention is to cause change. He's on a kind of mission to change the family. We've got this quotation from Sheila said in Act 2. He's giving us the ropes that will hang ourselves. Now, obviously, she doesn't mean this literally. It is a metaphor. What she's saying is that they have to almost commit social suicide. So he's giving them the tool, the rope, but they're the ones who have to accept responsibility for what they've done. And that would be a public social suicide, standing up in front of, their peers and saying, I did these bad things, I'm a bad person, I accept it, I want to change. Obviously, you would link this to various characters because some are willing to take the rope and some are not. Now, Sheila is not talking about herself. She's not saying he's giving me the rope. She's saying he's giving us the rope. So she's using first person plural pronouns, which is exaggerating this idea of collective responsibility. The inspector uses all of these in his final speech as well. This sense that the whole family have to learn from this and take the rope, and that's why you can apply this quotation to anyone. If you were using it for Sheila or the inspector, the dash for Sheila, these highlight her different moments of realisation. There's also one used in But These Girls Aren't Cheap Labour, dash, they're people. So you can use it for that one as well. And this kind of starting her statement with no, this is kind of illuminating these kind of arguments that Sheila is now beginning to have with her family. She's starting to disagree with them, not just in this moment about the inspector's purpose, but also about their ideology, their beliefs about life. This quotation is said by the inspector, and it's about Eva Smith, and it's the moment when we find out that she was pregnant, and therefore it's the kind of, although Eric hasn't been interrogated yet, it is the moments, a description of her before she makes a decision to commit suicide. We have what we call asyndetic listing. So this is lots of words one after another, and this intensifies Eva's troubling situation. There's this idea that she has no way out once this charity is refused. And this listing highlights her suffering that's caused by the family. The whole family have collectively caused her and pushed her into this situation. So therefore the list really highlights the sense that the family have had this cumulative impact on Eva's life. The inspector calls it a chain of events, this idea that each thing they do is connected, but this is a really good quotation to kind of talk about this chain of events, what it results in, and therefore you can kind of use it for any character. If we look at the individual adjectives in this statement, we can link them to different characters. So we've got the idea of her being penniless. That's obviously caused, it's an adjective to describe her, and it's caused by Mr. Burling and Sheila and the loss of her jobs, so the factory and Millwoods, and also we now know without a genuine cause. They've both done it kind of as an abuse of power. You could then look at alone and friendless as adjectives which link to Gerald and Eric. They ultimately leave her isolated, they leave her vulnerable, they start relationships with her that they're unable to continue. And then finally this sense of her being desperate links to Mrs. Burling and that decision to go to the charity, which is obviously then rejected. Now these 4 quotations all come from the inspector's final speech, and whilst Gerald is not actually on stage at this point, obviously it is a comment that's made to all of the family about what they need to learn, and really the audience in general. If we start with that last quotation, we know it's repetition because Sheila says it after the inspector's left, emphasising his impact on the family. It's also dramatic irony. Priestley is pointing at events that take place between 1912 and 1945, and he's essentially saying that these events are the cause of capitalism and the divisions in society in the upper class. Now, if we look at the modal verb will, that indicates certainty from the inspector. He's essentially blaming, well, Priestley is blaming World War I, World War II, the Great Depression strikes on the upper class and their selfishness, and trying to tell the audience that they have to change in order for these kind of things not to continue. We've got the metaphor of members of one body, again links to any character, this idea that all parts of society need to work and work together. And again, we've got those collective first person plural pronouns indicating the sense that everybody has to work together. The idea that Eva Smith is a symbol of all lower class women, and actually all of the lower class, because obviously then it says and John Smith, is a good one for that second quotation. And then this final quotation at the top, which is actually directed at Eric, but you could use it for any character as long as you acknowledge it's for Eric. The idea that they objectify, dehumanise Eva Smith, treat her as an object, each of them for different purposes. We've got these final stage directions now, so the juxtaposition between them. Pleased with themselves is used in the opening stage directions. That phrase is repeated by Mr. Burling throughout the play. He says pleased with ourselves, even after the inspector has left. So this idea that they're satisfied by their life, they're in a situation of comfort and protection, it links back to this idea of pink and intimate. Now when the inspector leaves, the family are described as left staring, subdued and wondering. So we've got this, again, another tricolon, a list of 3. And we can think about the impact of the inspector using this list of 3 in the stage direction. So he has changed them for different reasons, I suppose. Sheila and Eric are left staring, subdued and wondering due to the fact that they are willing to change and accept everything they've done. Perhaps Mr. and Mrs. Burling are staring, subdued and wondering because they're trying to figure out how to find their way out of it. We've got these verbs, these present participles, so staring and wondering, so this sense of kind of ongoing impact of the inspector. I hope that video was useful, and good luck in your exams.